His favorite girl was Heidi. She sat in the row to his right, one chair up. He could stare at her all class and she wouldn't be able to tell. He'd memorized the length of each blonde hair on her head and thought the world of her brand new clothes. Now, they weren't literally brand new clothes, but to Jason, it seemed like she had just gotten them at the store each day before school. He would occasionally catch a whiff of her shampoo, and he would breathe it all in, as much as he could, as if he was filling it away in his brain for use later when things got really bad or he got really lonely. When it came to offensive odors, his sense of smell had become utterly useless as a simple defense mechanism to endure the life he had to live. But when it came to a smell as genuine and beautiful as Heidi's shampoo, he couldn't help but become intoxicated by it. Many days he'd find himself daydreaming about Heidi away from school. Where did she live? Looking at her, he imagined that she must have been a wealthy, loving family. He would imagine her at home surrounded by toys and books and all the things that make a kid happy. Embarrassingly, he would also find himself occasionally thinking about what it would be like to be her boyfriend. Would he go to her house and be accepted in the family? Oh, what he wouldn't give to have someone to take care of him. Then again, he had nothing, so there was nothing he could offer. You wouldn't find Heidi sharing the same opinion of Jason. It just wasn't practical. It was true, there was a way about her, perhaps to a fault, where she felt sorry for Jason more than most of the other girls. Perhaps her empathy was palpable, and that's why he was drawn to her. She was never mean to him and made it a point not to make his obvious shortcomings an issue when he was around her. That was the extent of her philanthropy. His stomach just wouldn't quit. Eventually, the smell that he kept emitting got around most of the room, and there was absolutely no mystery where it was coming from. If another student had been doing it, it would have been no doubt instigated a full-on laugh attack by the rest of the room. Jason was different. It wasn't funny to anyone, more like annoying and aggravating. It actually began to anger some of the students who were trying to pay attention to Mrs. Shiloh, and being the astute teacher she was, she noticed. There was an otherwise patient instructor who didn't mind having Jason in her classroom. True, she wouldn't have shed a tear if she arrived one day to find out that he and his family had moved to another country. After all, she was human. There were times when she tried to remember what it was like not having a student as vile as Jason, when it was all about teaching and less about keeping the kids from making this one boy feel like an outcast. Jason began to focus on a small, closet-sized room built into the corner of the classroom. There was a student 2 years prior who required the room when he would have outbursts. If he got out of line, they would simply put him in the 3-foot by 3-foot closet and insist he calm down before they'd let him out. Jason had become so jaded to tiny spaces that his condition was worse than claustrophobia. Life in a cramped space was all too familiar, and he stared at the closet, growing increasingly nervous that he could someday end up in there. A final rumble of his stomach would spell doom. He was sure he was just letting a little gas out like he had dozens of times that morning, but it was much worse than that. The unmistakable feeling of liquid feces escaped his body and spilled into his pants. His mind raced and his breathing became rapid and unstable. He was in so much trouble. He slumped his shoulders in ultimate defeat and succumbed to whatever hell was sure to follow. He wanted to cry, but this was so much worse than sadness. It was only a matter of moments. Almost instantly, the kids sitting directly beside Jason covered their noses and grimaced. The boys sitting behind him began to dry heave as they all hurriedly stood from their chairs as if the fire alarm had gone off. "What's going on?" Miss Shiloh asked. "Jason pooped his pants again," said a boy, covering his face with his shirt. All of the students rose and scattered by the news. A few girls screamed. Jason stared blankly at his desk, looking up to make eye contact with Heidi, her lips pursed with a disgusting look on her face that suggested his presence was worse than opening a Tupperware filled with moldy food. There was nothing that could have been done to sugarcoat the incident. Even if he did it by accident, he had gone too far. "Ugh," Miss Shiloh muttered to herself. She wasn't in the mood to deal with Jason that morning. Perhaps due to an argument she had with her husband over breakfast, a headache, or both, she had had enough. It was time to take the class back over. "Jason, did you, go in your pants again?" she asked, trying to be tactful, but still sounding like one of the students who were now pressing against the walls of the class like they were on the end of a plank. "Can we go outside?" asked one of the girls, desperate to get it out of the room. It was the most horrible smell any of them could remember encountering. "Yes, everyone quietly walk to the playground. We'll have an early recess," Mrs. Shiloh said. she herself choking back the urge to vomit. Jason just sat motionless at his desk, staring at the cover of a geography book. There was a picture of a splayed map of the world, each continent a different color. Chaos ensued all around him, but from his perspective, it was as if everyone was moving and screaming in slow motion. He stared at the textbook and visualized where Nebraska was on the map. Lifting his pen, he pressed it firmly into the middle of the orange-colored North America and created a massive dent. If only he controlled the hand of God, he would simply push the whole area deep into the ground, and it would all be over. He drew a line from the dent to Europe and imagined himself walking across it like a tightrope, careful not to fall into the Atlantic. If he had been born on the other side of the planet, he would be the happiest boy in the world, or at least so in his mind convinced him. He wasn't a bit disgusted by his odor. It smelled no different than the place he had to sleep every night. The real source of depression came in seeing the class in such agony over his presence. He hated that, and so he focused deeply on the map. Where would he go if he could fly away? Even staring at a map of the entire world, all he could focus on was the dent he created over Niobrara. Why? Why did he have to stay? He angrily scribbled his pen across the textbook cover. "Jason, I think you should go home," said Mrs. Shiloh, as she quickly worked the knob of the window. "You need to clean up. You're welcome to come back later with clean clothes, but you can't sit here like that until the day is over." She walked over and grabbed the textbook from the desk, holding her breath the closer she got. "Please, no more," she said, walking away from him. "This has to stop." Jason sat motionless. How was he going to go home? He had no clean clothes there, nothing. What would he do to change himself? He could jump into one of the rivers and swim around until he was cleaned off, but what good would that do? Besides, Jason was terrified of the raging waters. He'd been raised to believe that the rivers were death traps, and if you swam in them or even waded your feet in them, you'd get sucked to the bottom and drown. Perhaps that would be a more adequate fate than the one he was living. To Jason, the rivers that surrounded half of the town were like a giant moat filled with sharks and alligators. There had to be a way to get wet and cleaned off without going home. He knew of a small stream of water that came off the Niobrara River to the west of town that ran through the forest. He could easily sit in that foot-deep water without worrying about being swept away, and then he could just bask in the sun, drying off until it was time for him to come home from school. No one would be the wiser. As he left the school, he could see his classmates huddled in various groups, staring at him and whispering to each other. Some would chuckle and laugh. It was odd to see them teasing him, but maybe he deserved it. He knew that he was too old to be doing that sort of thing in public. The question in his mind remained, how could he have avoided it? When a normal kid faced such dilemmas, they'd stay home from school and have a bathroom at their disposal. Had Jason been at home, he would have done the same thing, except he would have been in relatively private basement. He didn't want to risk running into the dogs north of the school and felt like the safest route in avoiding them and still getting to the creek would come from walking the main drag, despite the reality that he'd have to walk near other people in the community. The last thing he wanted was to be noticed for his smell, so he had to be fast about it. Unfortunately, the last word someone would use to describe Jason Thorn would be fast. Nervously, he trekked past businesses along the highway and couldn't help but read the faces of those he came across. They immediately reacted to his predicament as if he had tangled with a skunk and lost. "Boy, you really need to see that," said a worker at Lucas Station, standing out front for a soda break. "You smell like you crapped yourself. Geez almighty." He ignored the man and breezed past an old lady walking her small dog on the sidewalk. Of course, she noticed the odor and called out to Jason. "Son," she hollered. "Son, hold on a sec." Jason turned to her. "You in trouble?" she asked. "You need to see to that, issue you got there." "I'm fine," he said, turning to keep walking. "Now, I'm not kidding," she pressed on. "You need help?" "I said I'm fine," Jason said, as he continued on his way. Onward he trudged, growing more and more frustrated with each passing comment. If they were so concerned about his appearance, why was he like that in the first place? He'd rather be sitting in some fancy house, wearing new clean clothes, eating some exotic meal. He didn't choose to have the life he had. His stomach wouldn't constantly be in knots if he could eat just one good meal a day. Why weren't they making sure he ate? Feeling weak and disoriented, Jason slumped his head and got on one knee. He was tired from walking and exhausted from life. What was he supposed to do? This was his life. His stomach still hurt and continued to ball up in knots. The pain was intense, and he was trying not to relieve himself in his pants again. Enough was enough. In a burst of energy, Jason grabbed a loose brick off the gravel at his feet and threw it at a nearby window, shattering the large pane of glass with ease. He froze in terror as shards of glass cascaded down and exploded in slow motion on the concrete sidewalk. What had he done? It was broad daylight. If he wanted to be discreet, this was the farthest thing from it. "What in God's name?" screamed a man from across the street. It was his father. Oh, the luck. Jason would have gladly preferred some grumpy shop owner or even a sheriff. Father sprinted across the street, grabbed Jason by the arm, and screamed in his face. "What in holy hell are you doing?" he yelled. "Why are you out? And why do you smell so bad? Did you crap yourself?" Father examined Jason and realized he had indeed soiled his pants. "You're 13 years old. What are you doing crapping yourself?" his father screamed. He grabbed Jason by the cuff of his arm and pulled him behind the building into an alley. It was there that he administered a vicious beating. Father pulled a budding tree stem from the crack of a nearby foundation and whipped Jason with it 3 or 4 times, ripping the skin from his back and causing immeasurable pain. "You shouldn't even be outside. Why are you walking around Niobrara?" he yelled, shoving the defeated child to the ground. "I went to school," said Jason. "School? Did your mom send you there? Why were you at school?" the man hollered. I don't know. She let me out this morning and said to go to school," Jason said, content with the fact that his father didn't want him there in the first place. He wanted to deflect the anger towards his stepmother for allowing him to go in the first place. Maybe then his father would stop beating him. "That doesn't explain why you're walking the streets at 11 in the morning covered in crap and throwing things into windows," Father said, lifting Jason by his arm. "Why are you here? Did you crap your pants at school?" Jason nodded. "They told me to go home," he said. "And what about the window? You want us to get run out of the town?" Father asked, violently shaking Jason by the shoulders. "Is that what you want?" Jason shook his head. "You are garbage, you know that?" Father said. "Complete garbage." "She is so right about you, Jason. I have no use for you. Everyone would be better off if you were gone." It was then that he grabbed his son by the back of the neck and walked him to the truck. He shoved him into the cab and started the engine. "Now my truck's going to smell like crap. You know what? Get in the back," Father said, pointing to the bed of the truck. Jason got out and climbed in the back. The short trip home, Jason imagined jumping from the truck and ending it all on the crusty gravel of the ill-repaired country road. The streaks on his back from the whipping burned with radiating pain. He didn't feel bad about throwing the brick. If he could, he'd throw one in every window in town. Maybe then someone would notice him. As they neared the house, Jason got butterflies. There was no telling what evil fate awaited him once he entered those doors. He looked up at the sky and saw a white swipe and wondered how odd it was that he was stuck in such a desolate place while he could clearly see a vessel carrying people from one happy city to another. His father took the last curve with great force, almost knocking Jason off the side of the truck where he was sitting. He slid into the bed of the truck and lay down on his side, feeling every bump along the way. As the vehicle slid to a halt on the gravel driveway, Jason heard his father open and slam the door. He got around to the side of the truck and smacked Jason on the side of the head. "Get up and get out," he hollered. Jason did as he was told and was pulled down from the bumper violently by his father before he could climb down himself. He hit the dirt and was lifted up just as quickly. "Move," his dad said, shoving him from behind. The two burst into the house. Jason hunched over as father led him into the home with a grip on the back of his neck. He let go of the boy and shoved him forward into the front room. Stepmother jumped from the couch in shock, unaware of the reason behind the commotion. "So you sent him to school without telling me, without talking to me first?" Father said accusingly to Jason's stepmother. "We were supposed to talk about sending him back there after the last incident. Now he's really screwed things up." "I didn't want to deal with him today is all," she said. "You just head to town and leave him here with me all day? What am I supposed to do? I don't get some time to myself to just relax?" "Relax? Woman, you don't do anything. You sit here all day. No one said you had to let him out at all," Father barked. "Just leave him down there. You're causing all sorts of problems letting him go out there in the first place. This darn kid didn't last 2 hours in town before he crapped his pants. The darn school sent him home. Hell, you know where I found him? He busted out the picture window at Kessler's barber shop. I had to grab him and head to the alley to avoid being seen. You know how much trouble that would have gotten us into? You know how much that would cost us?" "Listen here," Jason's stepmother said, pointing her finger at his father. "None of this is my fault. He's your son. I'm just a passenger on this hell ride." In a blur of blue cotton, Jason watched as his father reared his arm back and connected his open hand with his wife's cheek. She immediately began to cry and fell to her knees. "I hate you," she belted. "You come with me," the man muttered to the boy. Father grabbed Jason by the back of his shirt and led him toward the basement door, quickly aiding him down the stairs. He flipped the latch and left without saying a word. Jason sat in his own filth, wondering how he was going to get clean. His rear end began to itch and burn unmercifully, and he frantically looked for something, anything he could use to clean himself up. For what seemed like an hour, he listened to the muffled back and forth of his father and stepmother screaming at each other upstairs. He wondered if it was just about him going to school or if the broken window and soiled pants were the catalyst for the screaming match. Jason took his pants off and used the leg of it to clean himself the best he could before shoving the odorous clothes to the side. He fell asleep, wearing nothing but a t-shirt, covering the rest of his body with his tattered blanket. The darkness was hideous. That day passed, as did the one after it, as Jason felt alone. He had soiled himself again and remained curled up in his own feces, the disgusting appearance the only reason Thunder paid him so much attention. Dogs are weird like that. Jason struggled to deal with the mental anguish of having nowhere to go, nothing to do, no food and no water. Even the loneliness was brutal. He would welcome a beating from his stepmother if it meant that she would let him out for a few minutes or at least pay attention. The sound of her screaming voice would even be a greeting he would approve of, if only to spite the silence that surrounded him. He would occasionally hear the sounds of someone walking on the floor above and imagined it being someone who might rescue him. Maybe Mrs. Shiloh would show up looking for her student, even though the last time they saw each other, he had been the one responsible for clearing the classroom. He was a special kind of hungry. When a day goes by with no food or water, the body aches. A dry throat doesn't just become annoying, it's painful. Jason went in and out of varying states of panic as he found himself so dry he couldn't produce enough spit to quench his throat with a swallow. Jason would close his eyes and tense every muscle in his body, hoping that he could somehow find the strength to bust out of his cell. Nothing mattered. He'd try to remember the songs in his head and play them over and over, always insisting to himself that he'd forgotten a certain verse or chorus line that he had to somehow remember. Occasionally, he would yell, not sure who would even hear him or why they would respond. He'd yell for food. He'd yell for water. He'd yell just to get someone to yell at him. Nothing worked in those first hellish days. Sometimes Jason would resort to talking to Thunder. He'd tell him about his mother and how great life would have been for both of them if she were still around. They wouldn't be trapped in that rundown basement. Heck, maybe his mother would have realized how insanely cruel his father was and she would have moved him away from Nebraska altogether. It seemed to Jason that the dog enjoyed his banter, as it would walk over and lay down next to his cage whenever he started telling stories. "We used to have this amazing swing set in the backyard," he started one. "I remember it was painted blue like the sky and had yellow seats for swings. This one time I got so excited that I was learning how to move it by myself, and I swear I almost figured out how to go all the way around. My mom came out and yelled at me to slow it down, but I didn't care. It was so nice just going back and forth. I wish I could show it to you." The dog just sat and listened, cocking its head every once in a while when Jason's voice would reach a certain octave. "Now, I just wish we could get some food or some water," Jason said. "Is there anything you can do? Can't you bark or scratch at the door? I can't do anything about it." Thunder just stared at Jason. "Of course you can't," he said. "You're just a dumb dog. It's probably a lot easier for you to deal with hunger or thirst." In a gesture almost miraculous in nature, Thunder got up and trotted up the stairs where he began wildly scratching the door. He whined and barked until Jason could hear the muffled sounds of someone yelling from upstairs. That usually meant someone was yelling for the dog to shut up. Thunder continued until they both heard the sounds of someone walking across the front room floor. Stepmother pulled the door open and pushed the dog with her foot. It was the first time anyone had opened the door in more than 2 days. "I said shut up, you dumb mutt," Stepmother said. "I'm really hungry and thirsty," Jason said softly, his throat dry and crusted from the lack of use. His stepmother closed the door and came back a few minutes later, placing a bowl of greasy dog food in front of Thunder before giving Jason his own tiny share of it. She also provided a small plastic cup of water. if you want to call it that. It was once the lid to a mouthwash bottle, and it was a mystery if the water was actually clean and had come from the tap. It would be just like her to make him drink something sinister. "Can I go to school?" Jason asked, knowing the answer before the words left his lips. If he could get one more chance to go to class, he'd tell the world about his predicament. Unfortunately, there was a sense amongst the family that he would no doubt spill the beans, and that just couldn't happen. "Get that out of your head," she responded with a snide laugh. "You know you ain't going back to that place. You made sure of that the other day with that little stunt of yours. Your daddy took it out on me. See what I go through for you? I ain't so bad now, am I? You got food in your tummy and you're drinking water." "I couldn't help it," Jason said, referencing the incident at school. "My stomach won't stop hurting. It's always hurting. I couldn't help it. I'm sorry." "You're 13 years old," she said. "You can make it to the flippin' bathroom at school. You need diapers now? I can tell you're covered in it. You like that?" Jason shook his head. It was pointless to argue with her, but if he wanted to, he could simply point out his lack of options in the toilet department. Where was he supposed to go? It's not like she would let him use the toilet if he asked to. His stepmother began making her way back up the stairs. "Can I have something to do, please?" Jason asked. "I'm so bored down here. There's nothing. Can I have a toy or something? A piece of paper? Anything?" Without pausing, his stepmother reached the top of the stairs and closed the door behind her. Jason sighed. It doesn't matter if you're a grown man or a child. Boredom is a powerful and evil weapon if used against someone in such a way. It can become worse than just starvation alone. Stepmother wasn't slurring her words or stumbling about, so Jason assumed it was morning, since that was the only time he saw his stepmother sober during the day. If so, that meant he had the rest of the day to look forward to sitting in the dark with no end in sight. By his calculations, that would be the third straight day trapped down there. The thought was unbearable. Minutes later, the upstairs door opened, sending a wave of exhilaration through Jason's body. What was it? Who was there? Was she going to let him go? His stepmother appeared with a notebook and a pen and handed them both to him. "You like writing so much? You can write while you're in there. That'll be your schooling," she said. "I'll flip the light on for you for a few hours. That's all I've got, and that's all you'll get. You're staying down here, though." Jason was disappointed. What was he going to do with a notebook? Draw pictures? Write a poem? But he'd take it. At least the light was on, and he could pretend that he wasn't living underground like a mole. Jason lifted his head and looked over at Thunder, who had finished eating his tiny amount of food. "Thank you," he said. Thunder curled his lip and growled at the boy. Jason opened the notebook, ripped out the first page, and stuffed it in his mouth like a piece of jerky. Pressing pen to paper, he would document his life, or at least the end of it.